Hello and welcome to this chess blowout video in which one side defeats the other in 30 moves or less. So today we have Garry Kasparov, one of the greatest players of all time. Some say, he is the greatest player of all time, but he's definitely up there, whether you think Magnus Carlsen is or some say Bobby Fischer. But at this point, 2001, Garry Kasparov had a 28-38 rating, and he's playing against Evgeny Vladimirov, 25-92 rated. So he's playing, a pretty strong grandmaster. Of course, not a super grandmaster like Garry Kasparov here. But let's take a look at this. So I'll run it through the analysis here. I won't go through all the moves. I'll look at those when we analyze here. But Garry Kasparov had the white pieces. He played a 98.4% accuracy level. One brilliant move, two great moves. His opponent had one great move, but only played at 84.9 accuracy, which is still good, but not on this level. So, one inaccuracy by Garry Kasparov versus one by his opponent and three mistakes. So let's see how this blowout occurred. All right, turn on the analysis, and one other thing. We could see what rating level they played at. So Garry played at 3050 rating level versus his opponent's 2450. And in the opening, 99.8 accuracy versus 99.5 by his opponent. And in the middle game, 97% accuracy versus 71. Okay, the game begins with Garry Kasparov playing e4 and attacking opening, e5 in response, and knight to f3, just attacking the pawn. So we have a defense by the knight of the pawn and bishop up here to b5 attacking the knight. So this is the Ruy Lopez opening where the knight attacks the pawn, this knight defends, and the bishop develops here to put more pressure on the pawn by attacking the defender here. So now a6 is played, a common move in the Ruy Lopez, forcing the bishop to make a decision to either retreat or capture the knight. So we have a retreat. Often you want to keep that light squared bishop in the Ruy Lopez. You can capture here and play the exchange variation, but a lot of times chess masters will prefer to keep their bishop pair, and in the Ruy Lopez, the light squared bishop can be a valuable piece. So knight to f6 here, putting pressure on this unprotected pawn, but Kasparov ignores that and just castles. So, if this pawn is captured, white could just ignore that attack or that capturing knight and the knight that's capturing the pawn, and just push another pawn and tempt black to take that one. But with his king stuck in the middle here, it becomes dangerous the more black neglects castling to safety. All right, so bishop to e7 is played, getting ready to castle. Especially if you're playing a great attacking player like Garry Kasparov, you definitely want to get your king to safety. So rook to e1 is played now, protecting the e pawn. And the bishop is attacked, driven back, and castling by black. So now play continues with this a4 move here. Just threatening to capture, and you can't capture back or the rook could be picked off here. So the bishop is developed to protect the rook. And now d3 is played. Just further reinforcing this e-pawn, allowing room for the bishop to develop. And so d6 in response by black, doing the same, just reinforcing the e pawn. So now knight at b to d2. So this is a common move by the knight in the Ruy Lopez. A lot of times the knight will move to d2 and from here to f1. And then from f1 it has options to either go up to g3 and maybe try and jump up here to f5. Or the knight could at some point land here on e3 and just try and help control the center. All right, so knight to a5 is played. This attacks the bishop. It also allows this pawn to move forward and put more pressure in the center. So what does Kasparov do here? Bishop to a2. So that's the best move. We're still in book moves here, and that's another thing about the Ruy Lopez. There's so much theory on this opening that for beginners, a lot of times it's not recommended that they play the Ruy Lopez. I mean, you can go ahead and try it and see what you think, but as you go up against higher and higher level opponents, there's just a lot of theory to know. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about playing the Ruy Lopez. But by all means, try it out and see what you think. All right. So instead of going after this pawn and doubling these pawns, we have c5, which helps really fortify this d4 square. So the knight, could jump back here now that the pawn is pushed forward. But we have that move that I was talking about where the knight was, knight on B moves to D2 and then down here to F1 where it can reposition up to G3 or E3, and maybe even possibly if this pawn is pushed, something like knight to H2 and then maybe up to G4, but usually knight to G3 or E3. Okay, so the rook moves here, getting ready for future exchanges in the center. Just developing the rook to where it's behind a pawn that has been pushed forward where it can back up that e pawn. All right, and so the knight moves to e3. So that is Garry Kasparov's decision here. And from here, the knight could jump up here and attack the bishop. What's another possibility? I don't see him going here immediately because of the bishop and, the bishop and the knight covering this. But next we have g6. Perhaps getting ready. Well, one, this keeps the knight out of f5, being able to attack the bishop. And also the bishop could reposition here and fianchetto. And then have maybe a future line down through the center to the queen side. All right, what happens next here? The computer says this is an inaccuracy, that it would have been better to push here immediately and attack in the center. But because Kasparov's opponent did not play that, let's see how the continuation goes. So bishop to d2. Computer says this is an excellent move, although it also likes h3, which, what does h3 do? Keep the knight out of here in the future, or prepares a g-pawn push, perhaps. Or, like I said, h3, you could reposition the knight and then jump up here and attack this knight. Okay. We just had b4, gaining space on the queen side, although the computer prefers bringing this knight back to the center. Remember, a knight on the rim is dim, so the knight just controls a lot less squares on the edge of the board, and it's usually good if you have them on the edge to reroute them towards the center where they cover more squares. So knight to g5, and the computer says that's an inaccuracy by Kasparov, that instead he should have played c3. Maybe fighting for control of the queen side here, where black is slowly gaining space. But apparently that is the only inaccuracy that Kasparov had in this game. So, moving on. The rook repositions here, of course, because the knight and the bishop on a2 are piling up on this pawn. So, you pretty much are forced to go there. Are there any other options? No, you pretty much have to go there. So the rook moves to cover the f7 pawn. And now we have knight to g4. Slowly, Kasparov is moving his pieces towards the king side. 2 knights, a bishop is aimed that way. The queen can jump up there. So how do we continue? Capture. So his opponent probably thinks, well, I better reduce some of this attacking force that's building up close to my king side. So the queen recaptures, and now we have a mistake. Bishop to c8. This move doesn't look too terrible. You're attacking the queen. Perhaps Kasparov's opponent thought, well, I'll chase his queen away. But what did the computer prefer? b3, which is an interesting option. Pushing here, attacking the bishop, trying to open up this b file, perhaps for the rooks. But after this mistake here, let's see why this was a mistake. Well, now the queen has to move and just moves to the best square, h4, where you're threatening an immediate checkmate here. So h5 is played, and that's the best move to stop that checkmate. And the game continues with queen to g3 here. So an interesting retreat. You want to get out of this pin on your knight that was the bishop was pinning the knight to the queen. So the king moves forward. Perhaps, well, maybe here by bringing the king forward, he can push this pawn up, which was pinned by the bishop here, and try and chase this knight away. But we have this move. A great move by Kasparov. Bishop to d5, attacking the rook. So, forced to do something about that, moving the rook to the best square behind this advanced pawn where you can help push it forward at some point. And now h4 is played. So this just keeps the space even here on the king side and reinforces the knight here in case the bishop decides to capture. Well, then the bishop could recapture and attack the queen. So queen up to d7. Perhaps thinking, well, I can move to g4 and attack Kasparov's queen and try and trade off queens, which is a good strategy if you're under attack and there's a lot of pressure on your king. If you can trade off some of those attacking pieces, that will lessen the attack and make it easier for your defense if you have less pieces to worry about that are coming at you and attacking you. All right, so queen to e3 is played, just avoiding that possibility of queen to g4, putting the question on what Kasparov should do to this queen, which maybe he would move here anyway, but then the bishop could capture and there would be an exchange. So bishop to b7, another mistake. Now Kasparov's opponent is probably trying to just trade off material, so he aims at this bishop, thinking I just need to get rid of that because the bishop and the knight are piling up on this pawn and this rook is just stuck defending it. And what should have been played? Well, it looks like the bishop, Kasparov's opponent should have given up his bishop pair and just attacked, captured this knight here. So the game continues with a brilliant move by Kasparov here. So the knight, jumps up here to h7, and the knight cannot be captured. Now, why is that? Well, let's see what would happen if that knight was captured. Well, then you have a mate in 14, but you would start this way, and now king up to g8, but then because this bishop is pinning the pawn, you can capture with check, king to h8, then you can pick this pawn off, and king up to g7 would lead to a quicker mate, so the king should go back to g8. But now we have bishop up to h6 attacking the rook, and finally bishop gets rid of that bishop in the center. Rook up to e3, threatening to swing over here and check. So bishop takes e4, being able to block here perhaps. But that can be ignored. Rook to g3, check. And if you have bishop to g6 blocking, the rook can just capture, pawn captures, queen captures with check, and it'll lead to a mate. So the best move would be to just give up your queen. But then you'd just be ahead in material. So we see how Kasparov could win that way if this knight is captured. So the knight cannot be captured, and in the game the second best move is played. Bishop captures bishop, but now we have queen to h6, check, moving up here anyway, and the king is pretty much stuck here now. He goes up to g8, and then we have bishop to g5. Now apparently it would have been even better just to capture this bishop, but Kasparov goes here, bishop to g5, and now we have bishop takes e4. And here Kasparov's opponent resigned because there's a mate in 2. So look and see if you can find that mate. There's also a mate in 3. Well, you probably see what the computer's recommending here. So you can either play it knight to f6, and if the bishop captures, then white's bishop would capture and then mate with the queen on g7. Or even quicker is bishop to f6, threatening the mate immediately. And then what do? If you capture, well then the knight can just capture and deliver a mate. Alright, so in the game, what should have been played instead of this bishop takes e4 mistake? Bishop takes g5 is recommended. So we could take a quick look at that. Bishop captures. Then what? Capture with the pawn. Then f5. And now the knight can just go ahead, capture the rook. Rook captures, and at this point, black is ahead by +1, but now we have this, just to capture the bishop, and Kasparov would just be ahead in material. What's recommended now? Queen to f7 to protect this pawn. F4, if you capture this pawn, then the rook can get up here in the game. So rook to e8 to help cover that. And now you can just go rook to e2 here. So get ready to double. And now the recommendation is what? c4. But anyway, you get the idea. Kasparov would just be ahead in material. So perhaps that's why his opponent, there was just so much pressure. And that is how a lot of these blowouts happen in chess, where somebody just defeats the other side very quickly. It's because, they might not even be ahead in material at the point in the game where it's starting to go downhill for their opponent. They just put so much pressure by aiming all the pieces at the king. We see all these pieces just swarming around, even in this position, or back a little bit further. We have the bishop and queen battery. The knight jumps in here. So his opponent's trying to get rid of material. Computer says that's the best move to try and knock out some of these attackers. But then once the queen jumps up here and the king, is forced to move, well, now the bishop just jumps up, getting ready to attack either way with bishop to f6 or the knight to f6. And so all this pressure just built up, and his opponent, I guess, cracked under the pressure. So, I hope you enjoyed this Garry Kasparov game from 2001, back when Garry Kasparov was the greatest player in the world at that time. Unless you consider possibly Fischer, who was still alive, but he was past his prime at that point. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and feel free to leave comments with anything that you would like to say. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.